How seller financing works when you sell a rental. York County, PA. If you own a 2 to 4 unit rental in York County and you're weighing a sale, here's what to expect. We'll walk through 7 parts, start to finish, so you know what's coming before you're in it. Land contract versus seller financing. The practical difference. When a York County owner decides to sell a 2 to 4 unit without sending the buyer to a bank, 2 structures come up most often. A land contract, also called a contract for deed or installment land contract, and seller financing, also called owner financing or a seller-carried note. The core difference. When the deed transfers, seller financing works like a bank loan, except the seller is the bank. At closing, the deed transfers to the buyer, and the seller files a mortgage or deed of trust and a promissory note against the property. What each structure protects. Seller financing protects the buyer's ownership. Because the buyer holds the deed, they have the full bundle of ownership rights from day one, and a default triggers a formal foreclosure, a process with defined timelines and court oversight. How each looks on a York County 2 to 4 unit. For a stabilized small multifamily with a credit-worthy buyer, seller financing is usually the cleaner structure. The buyer gets title and a clear note. The seller gets a secured lien and predictable monthly income, and both sides know exactly where they stand if something goes wrong. What the seller should weigh. 3 questions usually decided. How much do you trust the buyer's ability to perform? How do you want a default handled? And what does your settlement company and attorney recommend for your specific deal? Why some sellers prefer carrying a note to taking cash. When most owners picture selling a rental, they picture a check at closing, and a clean cash sale is a fine outcome. 1. Spreading the tax hit. A cash sale can trigger the entire capital gain, plus depreciation recapture, in a single tax year. 2. Turning a lump sum into monthly income. A retiring owner who sells for cash trades a monthly rent check for a pile of money they now have to reinvest somewhere. 3. Earning interest on the balance. In a cash sale, the seller's return on the sale proceeds depends on wherever they reinvest. In a carry, the buyer pays interest on the unpaid balance. And on a seller-financed rental, that rate is typically well above what a savings account or CD returns. Who this fits and who it doesn't. It fits less well for an owner who needs all the cash now to buy a primary home, settle an estate, or pay off debt, or who isn't comfortable with the buyer's ability to keep paying. What a typical seller financing term sheet looks like. When an owner agrees to carry a note, the conversation quickly moves from, yes, I'll finance it, to on what terms. The term sheet is where the deal actually gets defined, and every line on it shifts risk and return between buyer and seller. The 7 lines that matter. Purchase price. The agreed sale price. In a seller-carry deal, price and terms trade against each other. A seller may accept a slightly higher price in exchange for a higher rate, or vice versa. A simple illustrative example. On a $300,000 sale, 15% down, $45,000, a $255,000 note at a negotiated rate, amortized over 30 years with a 5-year balloon. What protects the seller? Beyond the down payment and default clause, 3 things matter. What's negotiable? Almost everything trades. Price versus rate, down payment versus term, balloon length versus monthly payment. A seller who wants a faster exit pushes for a shorter balloon. A buyer who wants lower payments pushes for longer amortization. The interest rate question on a seller-carry deal. Once a seller agrees to carry a note, the first real negotiation is usually the rate. Set it too low and the seller is leaving money on the table. Set it too high and the buyer can't make the deal work, or can't refinance out of it at the balloon. The floor and the ceiling. So the fair zone is usually between a safe savings rate and a bank investment property rate. A rate that beats what the seller could earn passively, while staying at or below what the buyer's alternative financing would cost. Why the buyer often accepts a rate at the higher end. A buyer using seller financing is usually getting something a bank won't give them: speed, flexibility, a lower down payment, or the ability to buy a property that doesn't cleanly qualify for conventional financing. Rate trades against price and term. The point, don't fixate on the rate alone. The whole package. Price, down, rate, term is what determines whether the deal is fair. A note on the legal floor. There's also a tax law minimum. The IRS publishes minimum rates for seller finance sales each month. Charging far below market can create tax consequences. Wraps and subject to deals. When they make sense and when they don't. If you've spent any time around real estate investing content, you've heard subject to and wraparound thrown around as clever ways to buy and sell with existing financing in place. What subject to actually means? In a subject to deal, the buyer takes over the property subject to the existing mortgage. The seller's loan stays in place, in the seller's name, and the buyer makes the payments on it. What a wraparound actually means. A wraparound, or wrap, is a form of seller financing layered on top of an existing loan. The seller carries a new, larger note to the buyer that wraps around the seller's existing mortgage. The risk both structures share, due on sale. Both subject to and wraps usually leave the original mortgage in place after the property has transferred, which can trip the loan's due on sale clause, giving the lender the right to demand the full balance immediately. When they actually make sense, these structures fit a narrow set of cases. Typically where the existing loan has a meaningfully better rate than today's, the parties understand and accept the due on sale risk, and everyone is advised by an attorney. When they don't, which is most of the time. For a typical 2 to 4 unit owner who simply wants to sell and move on, subject to and wraps usually carry more risk than they're worth, especially for the seller, who keeps liability on a loan they no longer control. The due on sale clause. What it actually means. If you've looked into selling a rental while keeping the existing mortgage in place, a subject to or a wraparound, you've probably bumped into the term due on sale. It's the single most important clause to understand before any deal that leaves your old loan attached to a property you've transferred. What the clause says. Nearly every residential mortgage written in the last few decades contains a due on sale clause, also called an acceleration clause. Why it matters for seller financing. So the clause is the reason those creative structures carry risk. The lender could, at any point, demand the full balance. And on a subject to, it's demanding it from you, since the loan is still in your name. How often is it actually enforced? Honestly, not often. But not often isn't never. For years, with low rates, a performing loan gave lenders little reason to act. As long as payments arrived, most didn't look. What it means for you as a seller. What this means depends on your path. If you sell free and clear, or pay off the existing loan at closing, the due on sale clause never comes into play. If you're considering a subject to or wraparound, treat the risk as real and get an attorney involved before you sign. And if a buyer downplays the clause, take that as a caution sign, not reassurance. Tax benefits of installment sales. What they really save. Of all the reasons an owner carries a note, the tax treatment is often the most valuable and the least understood. The core idea, recognize the gain as you collect it. In a normal cash sale, the entire capital gain is generally recognized in the year you sell. On a long-held rental, that can be a large number landing in a single tax year, potentially pushing you into higher brackets and a higher capital gains rate. Why spreading helps? 2 reasons. A simplified worked example. Say an owner sells a 2 to 4 unit for a $150,000 gain and carries the note over 5 years, collecting roughly even principal each year. The important caveats. Installment treatment has real limits and exceptions, and this is squarely CPA territory. Why this ties back to carrying a note. For an owner whose biggest objection to selling is the tax hit would be brutal, the installment method is often the answer that makes a sale workable, turning one painful tax year into a manageable spread, while also producing monthly income and interest. What this means for you. Now you know what to expect across the whole process. The owners who go in informed have the smoothest sales, fewer surprises, better decisions, and a cleaner path to closing. Want to talk through yours? Ed Lane, a local buyer in York County, is actively buying 2 to 4 unit rental properties directly from owners. Free landlord guide and a direct line at yellowhousebuyers.com.